Hello, and welcome to the Dr. Money Matters podcast, the show where we discuss important financial topics that were never covered in med school. I'm your host, Dr. Tarang Patel. A little disclaimer on today's episode. The opinions expressed on Dr. Money Matters by the guest may not reflect the opinions of those of the host or the owner of Dr. Money Matters. All information on this show is to be regarded as for entertainment purposes only. Please do your own due diligence prior to any investment. How many of you listening dread writing those annual checks to your specialty board for the privilege of maintenance of certification? For myself, I will pay over $3,000 over a 10-year period, plus a ton of paperwork to my board just so they can sign off on my certification. Most of you listeners do this as well, and we do this because it's just another one of the burdensome regulations that physicians have placed upon them to maintain licensure certification, and also most insurance companies now require this in order for us to properly bill for our services. Most of us have never questioned this step other than the typical grumbling we do, even though we hate the fees and paperwork. My next guest, Dr. Westby Fisher, a cardiologist from Chicago, looked into the board certification process, the board certification MOC process for internal medicine, and went down the proverbial rabbit hole and discovered, or should I say uncovered, a story that just seems to have very little to do with patient care or quality certification metrics. This is a long episode that I split into two parts, but at the end of it, I think you're going to be pretty angry. I would say you would be shocked, but with the way things have gone in healthcare, you probably won't be. So remember, this is episode part 1, and there will be part 2 released simultaneously. And now on to the interview with Dr. Westby Fisher. Welcome to another episode of the Dr. Money Matters podcast. My guest today is Dr. Westby Fisher, a cardiac electrophysiologist from Chicago. Dr. Fisher has been an outspoken critic of the MOC process and the expenses and fees and the quite frankly, the workload that physicians are having to perform without definite proof that it's improving medical care. Most physicians, particularly those who have graduated residency in any field in the last 15 to 20 years, have been impacted by this. Dr. Fisher, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Glad to be here. So
tell me a little bit about your background as a physician first, before we get into the topic.
I was went through medical school at here in Chicago at Loyola University Medical School, and then after that, I did that on a naval scholarship, and so I was had to go do work for the United States Navy, and I was active duty Navy for 13 and a half years as I did my internship and residency training in medicine there, and then went on to was a chief resident for a year at the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland, and then went out to the University of California, San Francisco after I completed my cardiology fellowship at the same at that same institution. So I was a Navy guy for 13 and a half years.
Oh, nice. I was Air Force for 8 years.
There you go. And so after that, I stayed in the reserves when I left the active duty, and then went into private practice down in Cincinnati, Ohio. I had kind of it didn't work out very well for me there because I was credentialed at like 11 hospitals and traveling between everywhere. And I was doing electrophysiology only. And there really wasn't a good setup there in that city to have one central area. There were just too many hospitals, and all the doctors went to all the hospitals. So it was kind of crazy. So I had basically a year non-compete with the group that I was down there. So for a year, I actually traveled the world looking for other jobs and consulting for industry for a little bit just to bridge the gap, and then finally found this job that I'm at currently in Chicago, and I've been there now, close to over 17 years. So I work out of a large healthcare system here in Chicago on the north side of town, and we operate out of 4 different hospitals in the area. And it's, I'm employed by the hospital system. So I've kind of lived all the different types of practices. I've been in a private practice setting. I've been in a military setting, and I've been in a large healthcare system as an employee. So right now I'm an employee, and I do strictly, I'm the director of cardiac electrophysiology for a healthcare system. So
like you said, you've kind of been in all the different models, and you've been at this for a bit. In reading some background about you, you've been interested in this MOC and American Board of Internal Medicine kind of controversy that has been happening for a while. So what got you? Let's talk about the MOC, and then let's talk about what kind of got you interested in this.
Yeah, well, MOC stands for Maintenance of Certification. It is a trademarked process or program owned by the American Board of Medical Specialties. All residents, once they finish training, usually sit for a ABMS board certification in their particular subspecialty. It's a way kind of to show both yourself and your colleagues that you know what you're doing in a particular subspecialty area. And the test tends to be fairly challenging. And it's kind of like a lawyer passing his bar exam. Once you complete that, you're allowed to practice law. And likewise, when you are done completing your board examination in medicine, you can practice in that particular subspecialty in most hospitals. When I began this process in 1989, when I did it for the first time with internal medicine, I was very proud of it. Basically knew that I would be board certified in internal medicine for life, because that's what the standard was at the time. As I continued my training after internal medicine residency, I went on to be a cardiologist and cardiac electrophysiologist. And when I went to take my boards for that, I had learned that the rules had changed, and that suddenly board certification was no longer a lifetime certificate that you earned. It was time limited. And in my case, for an internal medicine subspecialty, each of those subspecialties of cardiology and cardiac electrophysiology were 10-year time-limited credentials. Now, the ABIM, or American Board of Internal Medicine, argued that we need to keep up, and the explosion of medical knowledge was so great that we had to start retaking all our boards. And on the surface, that sounded reasonable, and we're pretty good test takers, so no one really thought too much about it, that would be too onerous. But as things progressed, when I started doing it the second time, it became more difficult and much more stressful, because I was farther away from the learning curve of reading 5,000 journals. I was really, actively taking care of patients, doing continuing medical education credits like we always had to do to fulfill our licensure stuff. So that was it was kind of on top of that requirement. And then finally, the last time I took my boards in 2013, it had changed dramatically. It was really almost hard to interpret the website, all the different things we had to do. Now we had to do a practice improvement module. We had to do surveys of our own patients. We had to kind of rub our stomach and tap our heads 15 times and be and on top of that, learn pretty much what was the equivalent to reading the Encyclopedia Britannica and trying to memorize all this information so that because you had no idea what in the wealth of information that was going to be thrown before you, what they might really test you on. And it became incredibly stressful. And I got, as I started learning more and more about it, I got more and more upset. I was up at 4:30 in the morning studying every day. I was finding that I wasn't getting enough sleep. I wasn't seeing my family. I would curtail family outings just so I could study. It was really tough. And It just didn't seem reasonable at that point. And that's when I started getting kind of angry and decided to look into a little more deeply why I was having to do all this.
So let me ask you this now. The exam that you're talking about in 2013, is that the General Internal Medicine Board certification?
No. I was lifetime certified in that, and I didn't have to worry about that one. However, I was at the time in order to practice cardiac electrophysiology, which was really my subspecialty that I practiced most of the time. I also had to be board certified in cardiology. If I failed my cardiology recertification, I could not be a cardiac electrophysiologist at the time. It was what we call a double jeopardy situation, where I had to pass both those types of boards in order to practice my subspecialty. And that really didn't seem fair, but at the same, and it certainly made the process much, much, much more stressful to undergo. Luckily, I passed both. You pay enough money, and I guess you get to pass. But I still had to go into a testing center, which was a new experience. The first board I took, it was kind of one of those little pencil fill in the blank things, and they did the Scantron paper, and that's how old I am. But since that time, they decided to computerize everything, but it was much more bizarre than that. It was almost dystopian. When I walked into this testing center, there were cameras everywhere. I had to put all my supplies and keys and everything in a little tiny locker. Inside that locker was a camera. I don't know what they were going to film there. There was, I had to be palm printed, and I was like, what the heck is this? I guess they have, now my palm print is somewhere out there in the ether for people to enjoy. And they had this thing, and every time you left the room and came back in, you had to be palm printed and scanned again to make sure it was really you. And kind of frisked and roll up your sleeves and bend over and kind of get cavity searches basically before you went into the examination room. And it really was bizarre. So, I consider that kind of insulting as a professional physician, but that's what they were doing. And it just was really very bizarre. So,
let's go into it a little bit more. You talked about the structure of the MOC and actually the exam itself, but the concept of the MOC, obviously we as physicians, we all agree with that it's an important process, right? To continuously improve ourselves, to keep up with medical knowledge, to improve patient care for physicians. It is important, right? I mean, isn't that what MOC does?
Well, I don't know what MOC does. I know MOC allows me to be tested and complete a computer test. I would argue that our patients teach us way more than any examination on a computer could teach us. We learn every day from our patients, and what the MOC process does not at all test is our experience. And patients bring new things to us all the time, and you definitely will not know everything that you see in front of you. And that's part of being a professional. That is part of learning. That is part of going to the literature and figuring out what else might be going on. That's a lot of what you do. You talk to colleagues and see what they might have seen. And when you encounter something really strange, and you do your homework, I mean, you really, you spend time with anguishing over patient care. The board and the sitting before a computer and trying to replicate that kind of process it only tests how good you can recall information and spit it out on a computer screen. And honestly, most of the things they teach are pretty classic things. They're not anything, and they're usually one particular thing. They don't have all the multifactorial things that go into taking care of a patient. They just can't replicate that on a computer. And so I would argue that there's actually no data that MOC improves the care that I provide at this time. I do think that there is some knowledge to be gained by, having to go back and read the literature and, devoting time to do that. But is that going to make me a better doctor? I honestly don't know. And I think that we might be introduced to new things that might have occurred since the last time we studied for our boards. But the problem with MOC is that in order to make sure that we pay for it, they've tied it to our ability to work and hold hospital credentials and to receive insurance payments. And, that's quite a motivator. If all of a sudden you pass your boards, you can't do any of that. And all of a sudden you realize if you don't pass those boards, you lose your right to work as a physician. And that's where I really got stuck with the whole thing and why I've been researching them for the last 5 years.
Right. And I mean, prior to the MOC being introduced, we've had the CME, CME conferences and things like that. Whenever you were getting privileges, or relicense, applying for your licenses, you still had to document continuing medical education. So it's not like there was a lack of education out there. So I think that's what's been interesting is that this process, I kind of went through it in radiology. I was one of the first, I'd say 3 to 4 years. I think 2002 is when they got rid of the lifetime certificate for radiology for the American Board of Radiology. And so we started the MOC process. And it was, similar to what you describe, kind of vague. They didn't really know what was going to happen. They had an exam at the time that they were talking about, and now subsequently I've taken it, but at the time they didn't really say what was going to be on it, other than just kind of similar to what you did when you got certified initially, and you had to do these PQI projects, and you still had to do the continuing medical education credits. It's not like that went away. So this is just added another layer onto it. And of course, anytime you add another layer, fees come on. And so for me in radiology, it was an additional almost $3,000 that I got to pay to the American Board of Radiology, or doled out over a 10-year period. That was in addition to the $2,000 plus I paid during residency to take the exams, the 3 exams I had to take during residency. So, and I think you've actually, in one of your talks that I saw, talked about not just the fees that you pay directly to these boards. You talk about the impact in terms of productivity. Can you go into that a little bit?
Well, I think the big thing that people have to understand is that when we have to sit for our boards, we have to leave our practice. And when one factors in the time away from your practice, the lost billings that you have, the time commitment for studying, the travel that you have to make to go to the testing centers, the hotels that you have to reserve, or rental car, or whatever it is in order to make the transportation, when you really factor in all the both direct and indirect costs, for the average internal medicine doctor, those fees represent $23,000 every 10 years that we pay into the board certification system. When one looks at all of the physicians, and this study was published in Annals of Internal Medicine that actually looked at the cost of maintenance of certification. Every 10 years, physicians pay $5.4 billion. That's billion with a B dollars into the board systems with all subspecialties. Realize there are about 789,000 physicians that actually practice medicine in the United States, and in all different subspecialties. And those are 2016 data. So, and 1/4 of those are internal medicine subspecialties. So, oncologists, pulmonary, those kinds of folks. Radiologists aren't under our umbrella. They have their own board. But suffice it to say, it's a lot of coin that's going into this system.
So, like you said, that's internal medicine. It's all, and the same is true. The radiology board, the American Board of Radiology, also That's their function, is to credential and run tests for the practicing radiologists out there. And family medicine, pediatrics, they all have this kind of process. So, these are nonprofit organizations that are collecting a ton of fees from their physicians. What's happening with these fees?
Obviously, we used to think that they were going to test development, but probably only about 20% of those fees are going to test development. 23%, I think, is what the pie slice shows on the ABIM's website. But somewhere around that number. The rest is, quote unquote, for research. And then lots of other ancillary things that we don't quite understand. After my third time of taking these boards, I got really kind of upset and had the fortune of having knee surgery. Had a partial knee replacement. And so I had a month off from work. And so during that period of time, I had been writing about my experience recertifying and had the fortune of having another person reach out to me who was also looking at the board system. And he happened to be a forensic accountant by the name of Charles P. Kroll. And Mr. Kroll he had time off between work too, and he had done some work and found that he was quite surprised at how many errors there were on the board's Form 990s, their tax forms that they had filed, particularly the American Board of Internal Medicine. And he started looking into it. I was writing about it, and pretty soon we connected. He was also from Chicago at the time. And so we actually had lunch one day and kind of shared our stories, and were really pretty amazed at what was going on. The biggest thing that we found was the existence of the American Board of Internal Medicine had created a foundation. And that foundation was advertised to physicians as being created in 1999 for the sole purpose of defining medical professionalism. Now, that's a kind of a strange thing to define. I tell people it's kind of like pornography. When you see it, you know it, and, it's there. You just got to kind of know what it is, and it's very hard to define, to be quite honest. But it's not too hard to see how the word medical professionalism could be turned against physicians. If they didn't participate in this program, they could be considered not professional. So very early in this whole thing, that the definition of professionalism had some inkling toward, if you don't participate, you might be considered non-professional, since you're not doing what the quote-unquote greater physician community would expect you to be doing. So that was kind of an interesting twist and a little draconian. But nonetheless, I think, you have to ask yourself, why would anyone need to define medical professionalism? So that remains a question. Many of those people who were on the ABIM Foundation and creating this white paper that they created on medical professionalism that was co-published eventually in both Lancet and the Annals and JAMA, those physicians now are working for insurance companies or pharmacy benefit managers. One of them was working for WellPoint. He left and joined WellPoint, and the other person went and started working for CVS. And so it's very interesting that these physicians who are heading that organization to define medical professionalism spun off into third parties. So, and these are supposed to be the people who are leading us. And it was clear that there was conflicts of interest that were occurring in the back end. It's just, ultimately we found that the ABIM was using some of the foundation had bought a $2.3 million condominium with our fees. And that came complete with a Mercedes S-Class town car, and that was chauffeur driven.
And what was the purpose of that? The condo specifically.
Well, I called Richard Barron, the president and CEO of the American Board of Internal Medicine, personally, and spoke with him directly. And he claims that it was being used for IT professionals that would come over, could room their and that they would be able to write off some of their expenses for the development of some of the computer systems that ABIM was working on. It's an awfully expensive acquisition when there's a lot cheaper hotels in the city of Philadelphia, and you don't have the overhead costs for that. It was interesting that at the time when all this was purchased, Christine Castle was the president and CEO of the American Board of Internal Medicine. And we suspect that because she had a home in Arizona, that she was flying out and using the condo when she needed to. Her tax forms suggest that she only worked 35 hours a week. And what we didn't know until after she left the American Board of Internal Medicine was that she was also on the board of Kaiser Foundation and hospital systems, as well as Premier Incorporated, which is the largest hospital group purchase organization in the United States. And that came out of congressional testimony when she joined the National Quality Forum. She had to disclose those conflicts of interest because most of the money that the National Quality Forum got were government grants. And this conflict was publicized in ProPublica, and she very quickly dismissed her those as inconsequential conflicts, but did resign her position from both those boards. So we have to ask ourselves, what was she doing the whole time when she was working at the ABIM? And we went back and looked at it, and she was earning an awful lot of money. She, over the 10 years she was working for Kaiser alone, she made approximately $1.6 million. And Premier, she made over $250,000 one year, with about 10,000 of that being stock options. So there's a whole lot of kind of shifty stuff going on in the background with the leadership of the American Board of Internal Medicine that's never been disclosed to diplomats who are paying all these fees.
And kind of doing a little bit of research from for this interview, I came across a blog post from Dr. Robert Wachter, the former director of the ABIM. And he indicated that, yes, there's been some controversy, yes, but it was never any shiftiness, never kind of, the condo was revenue neutral. He denies that it was, for that purpose. I'm not sure that he went into exactly what it was for, but it just comes down to the question of, exactly what you said. It doesn't really matter what was the purpose. Whether it was used for those IT people or not, it's irrelevant. It just, why have that? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, 2-bedroom condo is not something that a lot of groups are using. Okay, this is a personal space, and it doesn't take a lot of rocket scientists to also know that at the time Bob Wachter was the chairman of the board of the American Board of Internal Medicine. And Chris Castle was his close companion. Both of them lived on the West Coast. Both of them had homes. One could use the condo when the other one wasn't there, and so on and so forth. I mean, it was a very convenient place. And who knows if they were hosting parties there? Who knows if they were hosting people from industry there? We really don't know. And really what we need to find out is who really did stay in the condo and what was its purposes and who were they allowing to live in the condo. And of course, before we could do any of that, what did they do? They went ahead and sold it at a huge loss because we exposed that in 2014. Now, it took them a long time to sell it. It took them over 540 days to sell the condo. But I think it took about a $650,000 loss on the property.
Okay, so another good use of funds, and you could, So you because this was a very long interview, I wanted to break it up into 2 parts. So that's the end of part 1 of my interview with Dr. Fisher. The link for episode 2 will be up on the website and on the show notes as well. I encourage you to continue this discussion on the Dr. Money Matters private Facebook group. Let's talk about what direction you think your own MOC certification should go into, and any suggestions you have to your societies for improvement, and any crazy stories that you may have had about your own MOC certification process. Let's remember that we pay the dues to our respective boards, and we should have a greater say in how they serve us. Stay tuned for part 2 with my interview with Dr. Westby Fisher. Thanks for joining us on another episode of Dr. Money Matters. If this is the first episode you have heard, I appreciate you taking the time out and listening, and encourage you to listen to our past episodes. I would also appreciate you leaving me a positive review on Apple Podcasts, and also recommend you join our Facebook group where we have ongoing discussions about this and other topics in order to help each other reach our financial goals. Finally, I encourage you to subscribe to our email list and also to subscribe to the podcast itself on the various podcast app that you use in order to be kept aware when the latest episode comes out. More episodes of this podcast are available at www.drmoneymatters.com and on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Audio versions are also available on YouTube and Facebook. And you can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Money Matters, or on Facebook or Instagram at Dr. Money Matters, all spelled out. Thanks for listening, and if you get a chance, please leave a positive review for this podcast, as it helps move the podcast up the rankings on iTunes and gets it exposed to a wider audience. Thanks for listening once again, and stay tuned for another episode coming soon.